we want to spend just a moment at this point talking about speciation and what exactly is speciation. And so speciation is the process by which one organism, one group of organisms, gives rise to another. One species becomes two. And you'll agree from our previous discussions that what the definition of a species is not a concrete idea. There is some controversy and flexibility in defining a species. But we'd all agree as scientists that when two species are different enough, when they exhibit very different phenotypes and when they say cannot reproduce with one another, as we talked about in our biological definition of a species, that two groups of organisms indeed are different species. And so how does that occur? And so three things have to occur. And those 3 points are listed on our slide. We have to have isolation of the gene pools of the populations, and then we have to have these changes in the gene pools, and then we have eventually reproductive isolation between the populations. And at that point, we'd all agree as scientists that these two groups of organisms are different species. And so, interestingly, isolations of gene pools can take place for different reasons, and we'll talk about some of these in just a few moments. It could be that the organisms are physically separated by some sort of barrier. It could be that they're separated by some sort of behavior, this thing called niche partitioning. If two groups of organisms are similar, but there's not enough resources to go around, it may be that one group of organisms will seek out another niche. A niche being where an organism lives and what it does. So in other words, how it obtains food. And so the group of organisms has to find another food source if they're going to continue to persist. And so there's got to be some sort of isolation between the groups of organisms. And then the change takes place as a result of two things. Evolutionary change takes place because of natural selection, which we've talked about extremely thoroughly during the course of this chapter and previous chapters, and because of something called genetic drift. Genetic drift is mentioned in our chapter, and we're not going to cover it extensively, but genetic drift is this. And so genetic drift is, genetic drift is defined as random changes in the gene pool of a population. And so that's what we need to know regarding genetic drift. Natural selection results in changes in the gene pool, but it's for a very specific reason. The changes in the gene pool result as a consequence of the environment the organism is living in. But genetic drift, in the case of genetic drift, that's not the case. Genetic drift leads to changes in the gene pool that are completely random. And so, as an example of genetic drift, something like a natural disaster could certainly cause genetic drift. If we have a hurricane or a volcanic eruption or a flood that wipes out a large portion of the population, then all of those organisms have been removed from the gene pool. Their genes are not going to go on to the next generation. But the ones that were removed were just selected randomly. They happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It has nothing to do with how well adapted they are to the environment. And so that's an example of genetic drift. And so those genetic drift and natural selection are two mechanisms that allow evolutionary changes in the gene pool to occur, as we see there in point 2. And then finally, in this third step on this screen, then the ultimate end of those changes in the gene pools will be reproductive isolation between the populations. If that separation occurs for a long enough period of time and enough genetic drift occurs or enough natural selection occurs, and if the organisms are reproductively isolated, as we've talked about before, then that conforms to our biological definition of a species, and we indeed do have two separate species where we used to have one previously. When we look at evolution, and in particular speciation being a small step in evolution. Speciation is evolution, but in order for large macroevolution to take place, speciation would have to occur over long periods of time. And so if we look at speciation, then there's two general explanations for how this takes place. One is called gradualism, and one is called punctuated equilibrium. And as we look at the fossil record then, These two explanations for how evolution takes place help us to understand the fossil record. Gradualism says that evolution takes place very, very slowly. Changes accumulate in the gene pool as a result of natural selection and as a result of genetic drift, and eventually those changes build up to the point where two new species arise. Punctuated equilibrium is different. Punctuated equilibrium states that nothing happens, or at least very little happens, in the gene pool of an organism for long, long periods of time, and then over very short periods of time a large amount of change occurs very, very rapidly. And so punctuated equilibrium is a phenomenon that helps us to understand evolution today, and it's widely believed, although not unanimously among scientists, but widely believed that punctuated equilibrium helps us explain how evolution occurred and how much of the biodiversity that we see in the world came about. We see examples when we look at the natural world of isolation and then divergence in the gene pool, in two gene pools from one another as a result of that isolation. One example that we see is the California tarweed. And so California tarweed is a small flower found on the coast of California there in the Pacific Ocean. And interestingly, in Hawaii, we see it doesn't look similar, but it is a somewhat similar plant referred to as the Hawaiian silversword. And through genetic analysis, and actually just phenotypic analysis as well, we are fairly certain that the California tarweed is the ancestor of the Hawaiian silversword. It seems almost certain, based on the evidence that we have from the sources that I just mentioned, that tarweed seeds fell into the ocean, washed across the Pacific through the Pacific to Hawaii, and grew on Hawaii. And then, as a result of the fact that they were genetically isolated, certainly reproductively isolated, after the tarweed seeds made it to Hawaii, and B, the conditions on these two in these two locations were quite different. And so, as a result of that, speciation occurred. So think back to those three steps that we just talked about. We have genetic isolation here. We have a change in the gene pool, in this case as a result of natural selection, because the environments in which they find themselves are so different. And so now we finally have reproductive isolation. These two plants, despite the fact that they were once one species, are now so different from one another that reproduction cannot occur. We also see that in the case of animals, geographic barriers can sometimes separate populations. We see this in the case of species of shrimp, two species of shrimp now that seem to have once been one species 3 million years ago, that existed in the Caribbean and the Pacific Oceans. And so, interestingly, it's widely hypothesized that this little Isthmus of Panama sprung up about 3 million years ago, and before this time, the Caribbean and the Pacific Oceans were connected. If this were the case, then what we would see is that organisms could go back and forth between the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. And when the isthmus jumped up, then the organisms, obviously aquatic organisms, could not move back and forth. And so this is consistent with this divergence that we see in the Caribbean and the snapping shrimp. And so it appears, based on fossil records and genetic evidence, that up until 3 million years ago, they were a single species. And then, consistent with the geological evidence indicating this barrier arose at that time, there appears to have been geographic isolation and therefore reproductive isolation. And so we had divergence, genetic divergence, as a result of that isolation, probably as a result of just genetic drift in this case. They live right on either side of that isthmus, so there's no reason to believe that the habitat would be widely different. But regardless, today we see that we have two species of shrimp, the Pacific snapping shrimp and the Caribbean snapping shrimp, on either side of that barrier. They're quite similar and appear to have arisen from a common ancestor about 3 million years ago. Now, I want to finish with this brief discussion, and this may be somewhat disappointing to you, but in reality, in the natural world, things are a little bit more complicated than what I've just described. Oftentimes in this class, being an introductory class, we describe principles that seem quite simple and make a lot of sense, But then we have to say, but in reality, things are a bit more complicated than that. And so this is a perfect example of that. And so what I have on the screen are 3 common species of what we refer to as sunfish. Actually, I really have 2 species of sunfish on the screen, and then I'll explain what the other one is. This is a green sunfish, Lipomus cyanellus. This is a bluegill, Lipomus macrochirus. I pointed. The one on the left is a green sunfish. The one on the right is a bluegill. And these are very common fish here in central Kentucky. Bluegill will be found in most ponds and lakes, rivers, in the Kentucky River certainly, and even streams here in central Kentucky. The green sunfish is very common, especially in streams. If you go out to Jessamine Creek, there'll be probably more green sunfish than probably any other species of sunfish. Perhaps not more than long-ear, but a lot of green sunfish in Jessamine Creek. So interestingly, these 2 species can breed and produce a hybrid between the 2. And so this is a green sunfish bluegill hybrid that we see here. And so fascinatingly, this species, this hybrid rather, is not reproductively impaired. It can produce viable offspring. And so what I'm saying here, unfortunately, complicates this scenario that we've just talked about. These are 2 separate species that can indeed produce offspring that are viable. So what does this mean? Well, this means that the biological species concept, even though it's the simplest way to define a species, the biological species concept doesn't always work. And so the natural world is unfortunately doesn't always conform to our rules, and we have to look at things. Everyone would agree that green sunfish and bluegill are indeed different species, but the fact remains they can produce reproductively viable offspring.